It is my pleasure to introduce my boss, the president of Rutgers University, Richard L. McCormick. Dr. McCormick has been a strong supporter of the university's research on climate change, which he highlighted in his annual addresses, and he has strongly encouraged the university's efforts in solar energy and energy conservation, and all you have to do is go to the Livingston campus to see the products of his efforts. So please welcome President Richard L. McCormick.
Thank you, Jim, and a warm welcome to everyone. Please proceed with your lunch as it is served, as I and a few others will have the privilege of speaking. On behalf of Rutgers University, I want to welcome everyone here today. Rutgers is really pleased and proud to be hosting a dialogue on an issue that is so compelling for our state and our nation and the world. It's a very special pleasure to have Governors Kaine and Florio with us. They have been leaders for New Jersey over a very long period of time in advancing initiatives in the area of climate change and elsewhere that draw upon leading-edge science and from it create sound public policy. So Governors Kaine and Florio, please know how deeply you are admired for that, and we thank you for your presence today. I also thank and welcome our keynote speaker, Captain Tony Miller, and Mr. Adam Markham from Clean Air, Cool Planet. To both of you, we say thanks for taking the time to be with us today. Let me also thank, and here I look across the entire room, let me thank the constellation of scientists, engineers, social scientists, public health professionals, and policymakers, both from academia and from the larger worlds of which we are a part. Thanks, too, to the representatives of the state and local governments and the federal government, from the private sector and the nonprofit sector. Frankly, it will take representatives, it will take people, it will take men and women from all of those areas, all of those walks of life, all of those disciplines, and all of those professions to address the challenges we face with respect to our planet, and indeed that's what's going on here today. It's vital to have such wide representation so we can have a full conversation about climate change and a concerted statewide effort here in New Jersey to plan for its impacts and its consequences. Among my thanks, last but not least, to PSE&G for supporting the university in our efforts to facilitate this conversation, and I thank you. Here at Rutgers, as many of you know, we have a tagline, Jersey Roots, Global Reach. The issue of climate change and how to adapt to it is so closely connected to that idea and to our mission as the State University of New Jersey. Climate change, along with renewable energy, is a hugely important area, actually a hugely important multiplicity of areas where Rutgers can make and is making a huge difference. We're capitalizing on our interdisciplinary strengths, on the availability of resources, and on the relevance of the needs in our state and our nation to make contributions to these areas, and we're terribly proud of doing so. Our efforts to do that are aided by the fact that we have two visionary deans, Jim Hughes of the Blaustein School, whom you have already met, and Bob Goodman of the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences. I'm not sure if Bob is back in the room. I know he was there this morning. Together, Deans Goodman and Hughes and their faculty colleagues and their colleagues as well in industry and the nonprofit sector and in all levels of government have shown a collaborative commitment to bridging science and policy so that a concerted, pardon my voice, systematic planning approach can benefit our state and the nation and the world. So I'm enormously excited by the congeries of individuals who are here today, by the breadth of talents and institutions that you represent, and above all, by the challenge that we collectively have. The challenge we face has been highlighted, certainly within the past year, by the intense weather that those of us in New Jersey and around the nation and the world have had. It has focused attention on the immediacy and importance of these issues, and I commend you for spending today and bringing your talents together across all kinds of lines to address them with us. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, President McCormick. It is now my pleasure to introduce Adam Markham, Executive Director of Clean Air, Cool Planet, a position he has held since the year 2000. Prior to being the founding director at Clean Air, Cool Planet, he worked at the World Wildlife Fund's International Climate Campaign for 12 years. He is the author and editor of several books about pollution and climate change impacts on tropical forest ecosystems and has published in numerous journals. Adam?
Thank you again, and thank you, President McCormick, and it's great to see both Governors Kaine and Florio here. Thank you for honoring us today. It's wonderful to see everybody here. I run Clean Air, Cool Planet. As I mentioned earlier, we have been the co-organizer of this event with Rutgers, and Rutgers has already shown us some of the depth and strength of their commitment to the issue, and the faculty here that are doing country-leading work, nation-leading work on climate change issues. As we are here today, the international climate change talks have just kicked off in Durban in South Africa. When I worked for World Wildlife Fund, I went to many of those early negotiating sessions and was involved in many of the first and second Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change meetings. 10 years ago, with the founding of Clean Air, Cool Planet, I resolved to move away from the international activities, the lack of action in Washington, and try to work at the more local and regional level, trying to forge leadership here in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic. And the work that we do now is working mainly with universities, municipalities, and the private sector to try and find leadership actions on climate change. So as the international talks happen in Durban, you know, my email is buzzing with side meetings. There are thousands of diplomats and nonprofits there, side meetings at every possible moment, many of them about adaptation. I'm glad to be here in New Jersey at an adaptation side meeting because it's here that people are going to be at the cutting edge of actually dealing with climate change. Many people still, as you know, don't believe that climate change is affecting us. We know that there are changes. Most people can agree, however, that we need to prepare for whatever those changes are. And that's what we're here to talk about. People may not agree on the science. They may not agree on whether climate change is happening or not, although I imagine most people in this room agree on both things. But what we do need to do is engage the wider society in preparing for change. That change is already here. It's going to get worse. We've started to see some of the economic and social implications today. This afternoon, we're going to work in small groups to start thinking about how to plan for that change. And so I now just want to hand back to the Dean so that you can hear the key speakers, the keynote speakers for lunchtime. And thank you again for coming. I look forward to this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. It is now time for our distinguished keynote speaker today, Captain Tony Miller. Captain Miller is now on the staff of the Oceanographer of the Navy, serving as the Deputy Director, Task Force Climate Change. Prior to his current duties, he commanded the Naval Oceanographic Anti-Submarine Warfare Center at Stennis Space Center. He has received numerous prestigious awards during his naval career, and I urge you to look at his impressive resume, which is in your packet. And he has a Doctor of Philosophy degree in physical oceanography. Captain Miller?
Good afternoon, and thank you for that introduction, Dean. Governors Florio and Kaine, Dr. McCormick, thank you. I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk to you here today. I am Commander Tony Miller, the Deputy Director of the Task Force Climate Change for the Navy, and I work for Rear Admiral Dave Titley, who is the Oceanographer of the Navy and the Director of the Task Force. When Admiral Titley tells people about how he came to be in the position that he's in now, he starts out telling about his love of weather from the age of 4. Now, I can't go back that far, but I will tell you a little bit about my time at the Naval Academy, which you see up here, when I was there in the mid to late 1980s. I showed up to the Naval Academy and chose English as my major. I love to read, I love to write, and I thought, I'll get to go to a lot of classes where I can read these great books. We'll talk about the books in class, write some papers. This will be a pretty good deal. But it didn't work out quite that way because the program had a foreign language requirement, 4 semesters of foreign language, which I had never had before, and I signed up for a class that I thought was going to be beginning level French, only to find out that everybody else in there had had at least 2 or 3 years of French in high school before they got there. About 3 weeks into the course, the professor stopped speaking English in the class and forbid any of us from speaking English in the class. And before I finished that first semester with a solid D-, I knew I had to look for another major if I ever wanted to graduate. So I started looking around. I found the oceanography department. I said, this is pretty interesting, and decided that was the way for me to go. It took a lot of sales on my part. The department chairman wasn't convinced that I could really do it. He saw oceanography as a much more difficult program than English, and he wasn't sure I was serious, so I had to make up a couple of classes in summer school, and they eventually let me in, and I really enjoyed it. Now, I also had some meteorology in that program, and I enjoyed that as well. I enjoyed it all so much, in fact, that I attempted to join the Navy's meteorology and oceanography career field after graduation. But at that time, they weren't allowing anybody to go directly into that community. So I was a surface warfare officer, a ship driver for about 5 years. And at the end of that time, I was able to transfer into the meteorology and oceanography community, where I've been ever since. Being in the new community also afforded me some additional educational opportunities. I was able to go out to the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California for a master's degree in meteorology and oceanography. And as the dean told you just a moment ago, I was able to go back again several years later for a PhD in oceanography. And that education has laid a lot of the foundation for getting me into the job that I'm in now, assisting Admiral Titley in this task force. Now, I want to back up in time a bit to 1979. Now, that is the year that the Navy started using satellites to map the ice edge in the Arctic Ocean. They'd already been mapping the ice for some time before that, but when they were able to do it by satellite, it gave a much more accurate picture and a picture that could be updated much more frequently. So that began in 1979, and the Navy's continuously mapped the Arctic ice edge ever since then. By the time I was studying oceanography at the Naval Academy, a few people had begun to notice some changes in this Arctic ice. Now, I'm sure you all know the ice, a lot of the ice melts, the whole ice coverage shrinks back in the summertime, and then it grows again in the winter. The minimum's about in September, and then it grows again in the winter, and then next year it'll shrink again. And so on. This is a natural cycle that happens every year. But what people began to notice was these summertime minimums were getting smaller and smaller each year. At the same time, submariners who were working under the ice began to notice that the thickness of the ice was less and less as well. Now, these decreases in ice coverage and volume have continued through now. And in fact, the year 2007, you can see up here, was a record low year for ice coverage. And that really started to get the attention of a lot of people. It got the attention of our senior leadership in the Navy. And also, they started to put some guidance out in preparing to start understanding this and preparing for how these changes will affect the Navy. This was introduced in the Cooperative Strategy for the 21st Century, CS21, which directed us to prepare for operating in this changing environment. President Bush also issued the National Security Presidential Directive 66, NSPD 66, just before he left office in 2009. and President Obama quickly adopted that as his own. That gives us a not really an Arctic strategy, but it gives us some policy statements on how we're to operate with respect to national security in the Arctic. The Chief of Naval Operations at the time, Admiral Gary Roughead, asked Admiral Titley to come to Washington, D.C. and stand up this task force in 2009, and he did so. The task force is the way it has come up with a couple of roadmaps, one for the Arctic and one for climate change in general. And both of these roadmaps are a series of action items which the Navy will do to prepare, to ensure that we're ready to operate in this changing environment. Now, one thing I want to say is that we're not, everything we do is based on a consensus of science. We want to follow science, but we're really not manned or funded to actually do the science ourselves in our office. So forming partnerships is very important to our group. We work closely with the research activities in the Navy, with other DoD and interagency groups, and also with academia and even foreign governments. So that partnership is very important. That's a lot of what we do, is reach out with other people and work together with them, because we do have such minimal manning. Assessments are a very important thing that we're doing right now as well. We've done a capabilities-based assessment to determine how ready our forces are to operate in the Arctic. We've done a mission-based analysis to look at what potential missions we could be called upon to execute in the Arctic. And we're also starting a multi-year installation vulnerability study to look at how susceptible our bases around the world are to climate change. And I'll talk a little more about that in a bit. All of this is done to inform policy and resource decisions, really to make recommendations on how the Navy will invest the money that we spend. We keep monitoring the conditions, and we will update those roadmaps as necessary. The roadmaps lay out a period of 5 years, but we'll update them each 4 years, roughly aligned with the quadrennial defense review. As we get new guidance, as conditions change, we need to update our plans, we'll do that. And the idea is that we don't want to have a plan that's so short-term that we spend all our time updating the plan instead of doing anything with it. But on the other hand, it needs to be short enough that it can remain relevant and be updated frequently enough to ensure that it's always relevant. We certainly don't want to lay out a plan for the next 20 to 30 years and just forget about that. You know, nobody would be here today if we were all operating on a plan from 1980, probably. Now, you see the picture in the middle there is Admiral Jonathan Greenert. He was the Vice Chief of Naval Operations when these roadmaps were produced, and he signed those. I have him up there because he was the #2 man in the Navy headquarters then. He since has replaced Admiral Roughead as the Chief of Naval Operations. He's our top uniformed officer in the Navy, and he's the man who signed these roadmaps out. Now, having that buy-in from leadership is really what it takes to get things done, and that's been very good for us. That we're not trying to push our leadership in a given direction. Our leadership is on board, and they want to ensure that we're doing the right things and making the investments that we need to in the future. Now, I want to go back to the Arctic real quick, because one of these entire roadmaps is devoted to the Arctic. The largest concern we have in the near term is the Arctic Ocean. We've noticed this more and more open water in the Arctic each year, and along with that's come increased maritime activity. We've seen some increases in shipping, some increases in tourism, though both of those are still pretty small at this point. Big changes are coming, though, in natural resource exploitation. Right now, there are at least 5 or 6 different projects for oil and gas exploration that are either ongoing or planned over the next few years. And as I said, we expect to see more and more of this kind of activity continue, and that's certain to create more Navy missions. I do realize that I've talked a lot about the Arctic already, and that is the #1 concern for the Navy, but it is a remote harsh, largely uninhabited area that's probably not at the highest part of your interest level here in New Jersey or any other, local area in the U.S. So I want to bring things back a little closer to home for a minute here. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to Dr. Alan Betts, who is a prominent climate scientist, researcher, and has been well regarded for several decades. He told me that in his state of Vermont, the climatological growing season has typically been about 135 days each year. But over the last few decades, it has been increasing an average of 3.7 days per decade. So now the growing season in western Vermont is a full 2 weeks longer than it was 40 years ago. Now this growing season typically ends with frost in September that triggers the changing of the colors that New England is so famous for. But this year was an anomalous year, even in this kind of era of changes. The growing season was a record 191 days long. And it ended very abruptly with the snowstorm and heavy frost on October 28th. So much longer period and a much more abrupt change instead of that gradual change that they normally see. At the same time that they saw this long growing season, the weather pattern was more stable across much of the country than it normally is. So we saw what the map up here depicts, record droughts in Texas and New Mexico, along with record high precipitation levels from Ohio through New England, including here, right? So now, again, as has been said several times this morning,